U.S. Supreme Court Justice Anthony Kennedy has announced he is retiring, and Trump is tasked with finding his replacement at a time when the U.S. politics is deeply divided. Now, Lindsay Duncombe is following all of this in Washington. And Lindsay, we heard from the president. It was interesting to hear him say, and I bet a lot of people would agree with him on this, that outside of wartime, nominating a U.S. Supreme Court justice is one of, if not the most important decision a U.S. president can make.
Yes, and Donald Trump's list of 25 conservative justices is one of the reasons that many Republicans, including evangelical Christians, decided to vote for Donald Trump. So he certainly knows the weight of this decision. He said that Anthony Kennedy was an outstanding justice. He praised Kennedy, who is 81 years old. This decision to retire had been talked about, comes as a bit of a surprise. It is the last day of the term. Kennedy was appointed by Reagan. There is now a conservative Republican in the White House, so the timing to retire in that sense makes sense. And Donald Trump did say, while he was praising Kennedy, that he will be going back to that list of conservative nominees to fill the vacancy on the court. Here's more from the president.
We will begin our search for a new justice of the United States Supreme Court. That will begin immediately. We have a very excellent list of great talented, highly educated, highly intelligent, hopefully tremendous people. So it will be somebody from that list. So we have now boiled it down to about 25 people.
And timing is the really interesting thing here, Andrew, because in his letter to the president, Justice Kennedy said his retirement would be effective July 31st. And speaking not long ago in the Senate Majority Leader Mitch McConnell said that they would have a new replacement, plan to vote on a new replacement in the fall. He did not say whether that would be before the midterm elections or after the midterm elections. That decision would obviously play into the politics of those races as people choose who they want to represent them in Congress. The other thing that McConnell said was that he hopes that the nominee would be treated fairly. And that is something that's rubbing a lot of Democrats the wrong way on Twitter at the moment, because, of course, when there was a Supreme Court vacancy the last time with the death of Antonin Scalia, President Barack Obama had suggested the nominee or put forth the nominee Merrick Garland, and stalling by the Republican-led Senate under Mitch McConnell meant that that person did not get the job, and instead we saw Donald Trump with his first nominee now on the court, Neil Gorsuch.
Mm-hmm. And so I mentioned this being a momentous decision. So what are the potential implications?
Well, what this will do is shift the U.S. Supreme Court to the right for generations to come, because it is very likely that Donald Trump will appoint a young conservative justice. Those are the people that are on his list. And we have to look at the role that Kennedy played on the Supreme Court. Yes, he was a conservative. Yes, he was appointed by Reagan, but he was also often the swing vote, going to vote as a moderate in key cases that have really changed the fabric of this country, especially when it comes to gay rights. He was the swing vote in the decision for marriage equality in this country. And with a new appointment of a conservative justice, we're no longer looking at having a swing vote there. Instead, it would be very clearly ideologically lined 5-4 in favor of the conservatives. And there are many issues that are incredibly divisive in this country that could potentially come up in front of the Supreme Court, including access to abortion and other gay rights cases that would have a different result, presumably, than they've had up until this point, depending on the justice that gets this position.
Lindsay, thank you. That is the CBC's Lindsay Duncombe live in Washington. For more on how the top court is changing, as well as federal courts in the U.S., I'm joined by Maya Sen. She is an associate professor at the Harvard Kennedy School. And so, Maya, first of all, we should start, obviously, with the retirement of Justice Anthony Kennedy. This is another chance for the U.S. president to reshape the top court. I mean, just can you describe what that could mean?
Yeah, it's hugely significant. There's not too many retirements at the Supreme Court level. That actually means that when the president has the opportunity to do that, they can really shape the tenor of constitutional law in the United States. To have Donald Trump come in and actually make not one but two appointments so early in his term is actually very significant. It's going to enable him to have a lot of impact on the courts moving forward.
And so
it'll be one of his greatest legacies, no doubt.
Yeah, and so what do you think that could mean? You know, we saw a decision just yesterday, right, in terms of the Supreme Court upholding Trump's travel ban on a number of countries, mostly Muslim-majority countries. So what do you think that could mean? Because he keeps talking about this list of 2025 people. So what could that mean in terms of some of the decisions that we could see in the future?
Well, I think it's important to really note that Anthony Kennedy was very much a swing justice. So sometimes he would vote with the conservatives, sometimes he would vote with the liberals, but his vote was always in play. And people knew that, and the other justices knew that. And so he was very impactful and very influential. Now, whoever he's going to be replaced with won't play that swing role because he's likely to be replaced with someone a little bit, actually quite a bit more conservative. So it really shifts the dynamic of the Supreme Court in a much more conservative direction. So it's going to be a completely radically new landscape in terms of the Supreme Court. That's going to affect all kinds of rulings moving forward. I suspect the Supreme Court rulings will become quite a bit more conservative in the years to come for that reason.
So let's look at, our reporter mentioned, for example, that while he was, to the right, that Justice Kennedy, for example, on gay rights was actually, he was in favor of marriage equality. So what could that mean for something like gay rights or access to abortion?
That's exactly right. In fact, Justice Kennedy did not only vote with the liberals on those cases, he actually authored the opinions on those cases. Now, those cases are not going to be argued again. That's in the past. But moving forward, we might see other cases that involve same-sex rights pertaining to the benefits accrued to marriage, workplace discrimination against LGBT individuals. What that means is that progressives and people on the left can no longer rely on Justice Kennedy to provide that swing vote with the liberals. Instead, they're looking at trying to convince someone like John Roberts, who's actually quite a bit more conservative and very unlikely to vote in a progressive direction on those sorts of issues. So if I were a lawyer for the ACLU or if I were a lawyer for LGBT groups, I would be watching this very nervously and perhaps would be thinking that I might want to avoid the Supreme Court in the years to come on these sorts of cases. So as you said, LGBT cases is probably the most prominent example where Kennedy voted with the progressives and the liberals. But also I would be nervous about reproductive rights issues, also likely gerrymandering and redistricting, which are big political controversial issues in the US. These are issues where it becomes much harder from a liberal position to win at the court with Kennedy's retirement. So expect to see kind of a radically different landscape on those sorts of questions.
So when you say when it comes to access to abortion, LGBT rights, to avoid the Supreme Court, what do you mean exactly? I mean, in terms of what are you suggesting in terms of some legislation that could be put forward that could be limit access to abortion further in some states or scale back some LGBT rights?
Well, so I think if you're a lawyer who represents progressive issues on LGBT rights and reproductive rights, I think you need to watch this court very carefully. Any wrong move could lead to a long-standing precedent that's not favorable to your side. So all I mean is that if you're representing the ACLU or LGBT plaintiffs, you're not looking at a court that's favorable anymore. You weren't really looking at that before, but now you're really not looking at a court that's favorable. And so avoiding the Supreme Court might actually be not a bad idea, and instead turning to legislatures, in particular at the state level at this point.
It's interesting to note that Donald Trump said that there was a question about whether he would wait until after the midterms, and he said he hadn't really thought of that, but that's probably not in the plans, that it's important to get this nomination rolling sooner rather than later. And given what could happen in the midterms and given what happened to Barack Obama in terms of his choice while he was still president, where there was some stalling, is there anything that you can see the Democrats doing to stop this nomination from happening before the midterms in November?
Well, as you know, Democrats don't control either of the houses in Congress, and they don't control the White House, and they don't control the Supreme Court either. So this puts Democrats in a really weak position in terms of what they can and can't ask for. They don't have a leg to stand on, really. It does mean that they can point to some of the rhetoric around that delayed nomination of Merrick Garland a couple of years ago and use some of the language that Mitch McConnell used in stonewalling and delaying that confirmation hearing and try to turn the tables on Republicans and try to make the same arguments to the public. But unfortunately, I mean, that's something that they're going to have to pitch to the court of public opinion. They have no recourse in the Senate, and they certainly have no recourse in terms of the Trump White House. So Democrats actually have a fairly weak position in all of this. It's going to be up to Republicans whether they want to do this before or after the midterms. I can see pros and cons associated with either one of those positions. If I had to guess, I think they're going to try to move this nomination fairly quickly and secure that seat.
And then finally, Maya, just given the decision yesterday in terms of giving the president some broad powers, some would say too much when it comes to the travel ban, for example. Are you concerned that in the future, given that Trump is going to nominate a conservative justice, most likely, do you have concerns about that there could be even more overreach that some would suggest by a U.S. president, given the reshaping of the court?
I think that's a very real possibility moving forward. I think what we have to understand here is that the Supreme Court of the United States is about to become a lot more conservative. If that's something that's aligned with your ideological interest, then that's great because the court is moving in your direction. If you're someone who's more progressive on policy issues, who's maybe more opposed to a powerful military executive, these are things to perhaps be worried about. But I think that the overarching takeaway is that the Supreme Court of the United States is going to become more conservative in the next couple of years.
It's really been interesting to get your insight on this. Maya, thank you very much.
You're welcome.
That's Professor Maya Sen at the Harvard Kennedy School in Cambridge, Massachusetts.